This video was recorded at the Spring Institute, March 2021. Our guest speaker in this video is Candace Jones, Chair of Global Creative Enterprise, School of Business, University of Edinburgh.
I'm really happy to be here today and share with you my research and the approach I use. I really use a combination of visualizing things and also what I would call, and it wasn't actually my term, somebody else said, this is what you do dialectics, which is integrating, comparing, contrasting multiple points of view to understand the dynamics of a situation. So right now, what I want us to look at is how visualizing data can help us understand a context. And I'm going to focus on the study I did of the North End with my two PhD students. That essentially, I'm going to show you two pictures. One is a picture that was taken around, or it's a sketch that was taken around 1900, and what it shows is the Boston's North End, and what it shows is it's landlocked essentially by the ocean and by a river. So why is that important? Well, partly because it has shaped the institutional and building trajectory of the North End, because I'm going to show you a more contemporary picture. And this is the picture in around, I think, let's see what year it is. I think it's around 2010, and it hasn't changed appreciably. It's still landlocked, it's still highly dense. And what that means is that the changes that happened in Boston happened by a layering process as people moving in and out. And so the geography of Boston was important, and showing people what that geography looked like was important in terms of understanding the dynamics of place in Boston as North End. Now, why do we visualize data and why do we engage in data dialectics? Well, visualizing data helps us reveal the social construction process. Social construction really, this is Berger and Luckman's work, focuses on exteriority and objectivity, which is how we come to know things as being real. We interpret them, we have subjective meaning, but we also point to and understand the world around us in terms of phenomena. So visualizing helps do that. In terms of data dialectics, this process is really the art of investigating or discussing the truth of opinions. It's the ability to view issues from multiple perspectives and arrive at a more economical, reasonable reconciliation between these contradictory pieces of information and points of view. It involves triangulation among multiple data sources to gain insight into the various perspectives. And it also examines the methods used. It's the methods being used in institutionalizing place. So one of the key challenges always in methods is how you're going to connect theory and data. In qualitative methods, they're recursive. So that means what you're doing is constantly moving back and forth between the data and the orienting theory that you use. And so what it means also is that you engage in something that's called constant comparative method. You're always contrasting. Now, if it's longitudinal data of a case or a longitudinal case analysis, it may be before and after some kind of event. If it's comparative, it may be like two different cities or two different groups. Kate Kellogg's work is a good example of this. What comparisons will you make is a really important question in constant comparative or grounded theory. So which units are you going to compare and code over time? Dialectics involves comparing multiple data and diverse points of view. So what data sources help you reveal the processes and illuminate theory? So it becomes very, very important that you identify the appropriate data you think that can give you insight, and being very clear about that. Whose perspectives are needed to capture a holistic perspective so you understand multiple points of view, and those, by contrasting those points of view, you can gain insight. In terms of institutionalizing place, place is really the interplay of geographic location, which is a set of meaning, and I'm can't read my slides here because of the way the pictures, oh, there we go. Material forms. We draw on this also from architects. They talk about the genus loci, which is the distinctive spirit of a place, which is one of the things we're trying to capture in this piece. And that places are fundamentally material things. So it's the built environment, it's how people interact with it, because it represents homes, it represents their workplaces, schools, places they gather. To institutionalize means to make something semi-permanent of a social sort. So how does it persist across time in terms of either understandings or usages or interpretations? And what I'm going to do in this particular study is we're looking at how the micro foundations institutionalize or deinstitutionalize the meanings and materials of place, which we can see and trace visually. So the micro foundations are cognition, communication, and behavior. So we're going to draw on each element of these three things. So to reveal the institutional micro foundations of place, we're going to look at place as an unwindable spiral of material form and interpretive understanding. So that means we're going to look at different places and how they're being used and how they're interpreted and experienced. Material forms evoke memories, they trigger identities, and they embody histories. So cognition is really the expression of who and what a place is. So what does a place mean to people? How do they experience it? Communication really looks at people's written histories, and in this case, we use things like oral histories, sermons, media reports. And behavior, in the case of this study, was really both departing and staying in the North End, as well as what they did with the environment. Were they erecting, altering, or demolishing buildings, and whose buildings? So the case study is Boston from 1630 to 1980. So we originally, I'm going to give you some background and you'll see how messy these kind of data projects can be. It originally started with 22 neighborhoods because that's how many neighborhoods are in Boston. But I will put a caveat here that people in Boston don't agree with how many neighborhoods there are. So when we went to different sources, they wouldn't list the same number of neighborhoods. Sometimes they collapse neighborhoods, sometimes they would expand and differentiate neighborhoods. So that was interesting in itself, but around 20. Multiple perspectives on Boston and what it meant to the residents. So what we did here was we looked at the oral histories that were gathered for the 1976 bicentennial. That's the 200-year anniversary of both Boston and the United States. And what it meant was that each neighborhood was tasked by the mayor to feature its own history, its significant events or places, famous native sons, the impact of topographical changes, immigration, and unique architecture. And each neighborhood was to gather people to give their point of view about what these things were for their neighborhood. So in terms of communication, we did things like we read newspaper articles, we read sermons, we read reports, which tended to focus on a few neighborhoods, the newspaper articles in particular. And what that meant is they tended to focus on the more elite and at some points more white neighborhoods. And in the behavior, we're actually looking at people and buildings. So we looked at census data on all the neighborhoods, and there were three different sources for census data. There's the US Census data, there's the Massachusetts Census data, and then there was the Boston City Census data. And we triangulated these to see who was in which neighborhood over time. The census data did not start collecting data on race until 1820 and on ethnicity until 1850. So the very early periods, we just really have missing history and we have to rely on historians' interpretations. Buildings, we looked at landmark petitions, and these are petitions both at the national level and at Boston level where people put forth a building, usually people in the neighborhood or its occupants, and say, we think this building represents something significant about us and our role in the neighborhood and in the city. So we focused, these focused also on a few neighborhoods, and we focused on a few specific buildings, and then we collected additional data on those buildings, things like their annual reports, descriptions, historical narratives about them. So we went from 22 neighborhoods originally down to 4 neighborhoods, and then we ended up with just 1 neighborhood and the North End. And the reason for doing that is because it just really got complicated. So by engaging the data, this led to narrowing the study and going more in depth. And for several reasons. Of the only 14 neighborhoods actually had oral histories from 1976. So this was interesting in itself. We were missing the upper class neighborhoods, white neighborhoods like Beacon Hill and Back Bay. And we're also missing the lower class neighborhoods that were primarily African Americans, such as Dorchester and Mattapan. I don't really understand why these two ends of the spectrum opted not to give neighborhood reports, but they just are not anywhere to be found. There were only 8 neighborhoods that had histories written by historians. So again, there's a selectivity in terms of whose history had actually been captured. So the 4 neighborhoods we had decided to focus on was the North End, because it had early change and it was dominant Italian. The South End, because it had early changed and it remained changing. It was always very mixed race and ethnicity. And Dorchester changed from white to African American, and Charlestown has stability. It was Italian pretty much the whole period. And then we ended up focusing on the North End because, again, it was too much data to write in one paper. So that's one thing for you to think about when you're doing your studies, is you will collect far more data than what you may be able to write in one paper that you're going to publish in a journal. And so think about how to parse your data and where you want to focus your story. So the next step for us was coding, and that was coding temporal sequences, places, and people. So we started with, all 3 of the authors read the 1976 oral history reports initially for all the neighborhoods. So that enabled us to compare interpretations and coordinate our coding. And we literally physically said, okay, what's happening at which points in time? So what are the key events? What places do they mention? So where do people talk about when they're doing this oral histories? What do they point to? And then who are the people who are being talked about, and who do they point to? We divided the task for data collection. Tyhoon, who is a PhD student at Boston College, collected the census data because he's a very good kind of quantitative, meticulous, detail-oriented person. Ju Young collected the newspaper articles because that's his skill set, was collecting archival data. And the history of Boston and its various neighborhoods were me, so I was collecting the historical studies, and we were sharing these. We coded the neighborhood histories and oral histories. So what we did was, for the 4 neighborhoods originally, we wrote them up as cases. So we wrote 1 to 4 page summaries of the things I just said above, identifying the temporal sequences. And then we just, as I mentioned earlier, coded for places. And these tended to be things like parks, churches, businesses, streets, etc. So what were people actually pointing to? And what we noticed through this initial process was that churches were significant sites of meaning and interaction. And people pretty consistently pointed to churches. And they also attached particular churches to particular specific areas and immigrant groups. So that was a very important insight for us. And then we were tracing who resided in which neighborhoods when. So the next phase is we compare the temporal sequences from coding the oral histories to the census data itself. And we did this because we wanted to see who was present and absent in the oral histories. And that was a really important thing, right? Because we've all heard the old adage that history is written by the winners. So whoever is present at the moment is the people who are writing history. And what we really could see was in these oral histories is that the dominant group at that time overrepresented their own history. So for example, with the North End, they had 13 interviews or maybe 11 interviews. And probably 60 to 70% of those were from Italians. And there was 1 Jewish American and 1 Irish. And that was the extent of the history that was being captured. This led to a second round of data collection for us to search for those absent groups that we knew had been in the neighborhoods because of the census data. So this is data triangulation and using an approach of data dialectics to understand what's present and what is absent. What we did then, once we had the census data, is we started visualizing that in terms of graphs. And I'm showing you a graph right now that goes from 1850 to 1970. And what you'll notice, if you can see the graph, is that the first line is really capturing the Irish. And that was more than about 40% or so up until 1890. And then they dropped precipitously. And then what we can see is the second group that actually is present is actually Eastern European, which tended to be Jewish immigrants. And they are about 10% of the population and then drop around 1910 and just remain quite low in the neighborhood. And the third thing that you'll see is that the Italian Americans start really moving into the neighborhood around 1870 or so, and then they really take off around 1890, and then they come to dominate the neighborhood around 1900, 60% of the population. And then it drops a bit, but it remains, relatively stable at about 30% of the neighborhood around 1940 or 50, and then it goes back up to being, again, almost 60%. So they're the dominant group over time in this particular neighborhood. So the next thing we wanted to know was who's staying and who's leaving. So again, we start to visualize the data. And when are the transition points? So what we're looking at here is from the census data, we could actually see who was native born, that is born in the neighborhood as a child, and who moved in and came from a foreign country. And so what we can see is that there's quite a bit of transition, almost equal transition between being born in the neighborhood and moving into it between 1850 and 1875. What really becomes interesting is that 1890 and 1905, almost 90% of the neighborhood is foreign born. So this is a point that is a key transition where essentially you're getting replacement of people. Now, if you know about institutional theory, you know that people are one of the major carriers of institutions. This is from Dick Scott's work. And then Tamar Zilber has written a great piece on the Rape Crisis Center, where she shows that turnover in people fundamentally changed the organization. So what we have is a really important point here that we can identify by visualizing and tracing the data. And then from about 1910 on, the native born goes up until they are about 70% in 1950. And this is where it enables the Italian Americans to really claim the North End as their neighborhood and representing them. They drop a little bit in the 1960s and 70s, and then it goes back up again in 1980 to about 80% of the neighborhood as being native born. So it provides a stability over time such that the neighborhood becomes very tightly coupled with the identity and interpretation of Italian American. And still to this day, people refer to the North End as the Italian neighborhood, even though it's gentrified and has much more diversity than that. So I'm going to go to the next slide now. And one of the things to think about is, again, to help yourself visualize the data by thinking about who are you comparing, what is stable and what is changing over time. That was the core issue for us. So we made this little table where we thought of, okay, if we focus on churches as sites of social interaction and memory, what is our research design going to be? And so we wanted to compare between and within cases across time. So what does that mean? We wanted, and we were comparing two key forms of materiality. One was the buildings. So was the building still existing, or had it been destroyed? So is it still present in the neighborhood, or was it just literally erased? And then with people, the groups that were stable and the groups that were dynamic. And then we compared them and identified churches that we could drop down into and do a lot more in-depth research on the particular churches and their history. This is where we were looking at the annual reports, the writings, etc., within each unit of the church. And so what we found was Christ Church was both stable and preserved. That is, it had somewhat stable people and it was preserved as a building. And that a stable building that had been destroyed was St. Mary's. And that dynamic was St. Stephen's. So that meant they had people turning over in the church. It shifted who was using it and how. And also Baldwin Synagogue, which I will go into these in just a moment. So our in-depth focus on churches, we identified those as key to immigrant groups. What we were doing methods-wise is something called selected, a polar approach, which is Eisenhart and Grabner in 2007 described, where you're specifically contrasting distinct groupings or entities so that you can gain insight through the comparison. And this again is the constant comparative method. So Christ Church was actually English settlers. It's Episcopal, it still is an Episcopal church, which is the Church of England. St. Mary's was an Irish Catholic church. Baldwin Synagogue was obviously Jewish, and St. Stephen's was Italian Catholic. So we figured we had now captured the key groups that we had talked about and we knew from the census. So by focusing in on these key buildings that could represent the history of the North End through them. And we divided the churches up amongst us, and we really went and did in-depth research on each church. We again wrote case histories for each of the churches, and we shared these in weekly meetings. I read most of the primary material, and I would just advocate this, that someone on your team who has deep knowledge of the context really needs to be reading most of the material. I was an American citizen, and so I had a lot of history and knowledge of America. The two PhD students are Korean, so there were things that they just wouldn't catch because it depends on an embedded knowledge of the history. I'm going to go through Christ Church right now. It's also called Old North Church. It was founded in 1790. And what we found through doing this analysis was the goal here was to protect the church. And how they did that was actually engaging in something called multivocality. That's allowing multiple voices to be heard. The church is the Church of England, which is actually based on Wren's, Christopher Wren's, a very famous English architecture, his church in London. In this church, both British Tories and American revolutionaries sat cheek by jowl. They were mixed in terms of the political affiliation. And I'm showing a picture right now of Christ Church, the interior. And what is very clear, if you know anything about church architecture, is it's white, it's very simple, there's no stained glass, it's very clean looking, and this represents Protestant ideals. So this is a very clear statement of the identity and the orientation of the members and who attend it and who also designed and used it. The revolutionaries used the church tower to signal British troop movements. So this is during the War of Independence in the United States in 1776. So it becomes very important symbolically. And it's also very ironic that a British church based on British ideals and the Church of England would be used as the site to break away from Britain. I'm now showing a little picture of the Old North Church, and it has two pictures of two lanterns. And this was the code that was used, one if by land, two if by sea. So this is how the Americans were letting the fellow revolutionaries know where the attack was coming from. As a church, it shrunk in 1823. And what's really interesting was in reading the rector's sermons, they start preaching the role of the church in the American Revolution. So essentially, they're starting to shift the focus of the church from God to really its role as in America. And then the sextons in the church created guidebooks honoring both the British and the revolutionaries. Now that's an interesting issue. Why would you honor the people apparently that you had booted out, which are the British, but they chose to do that, which is part of the multivocality. In 1927, they start doing a ritual called the Lantern Ceremony, which is based on hanging lanterns in the tower. And I'm showing a picture here from 2018 where you can buy tickets to go see the Lantern Ceremony. They still do it today, so more than 90 years later. And what's really interesting is on the 250th birthday of the church, they actually herald 250 years of freedom, 250 years of God, I think the writing is over it. But so it shows the shift of the church away from its primary focus as a church to that of an American icon. And then this is what I'm showing you now is just a picture of the church and the steeple. So Baldwin Synagogue was in the 1870s. This was a really interesting building because it kept being repurposed, and which meant that the history of the church and the identity of the people kept being layered over time. So it was first a Baptist church in 1811. In 1865, it became an orphanage. In 1889, it became a synagogue, and the Jewish participants there left in 1920. I'm now showing a very old vintage photo of the church and the street on which it resided. The Jewish synagogue was primarily made of Russian, Lithuanian, and Polish Jewish people who opened their own synagogues in the North End. I'm sorry, I don't know who's calling me. On the North End and later on Baldwin Place. And they called it Jerusalem Place so that they could signify their identity with Israel. I'm showing a more contemporary version of the building at this point. You can see it's red brick. In 1920, the city of Boston purchased the building, and then they demolished it in 1923, erecting first a health unit, and then they converted these to high-end apartments. So what I'm showing now is an interior of a high-end apartment. So the church has now become, or the synagogue has become a residential complex. And in 1926, this is a statement from one of the interviewees. In 1926, when my family moved out, there were only 12 Jewish families left in the whole of the North End. And really the only thing that still remains in the North End of a Jewish presence is the sign called Jerusalem Place. And so if you're walking around the North End, you would have no idea at all whatsoever that there had actually been a pretty vibrant Jewish community within the North End. The next building we did was the St. Mary's. And the goal here was really by people to maintain their building and to restrict the meaning to being Catholic. Irish Catholic. So it was people from County Donegal, Ireland, settled in the North End, and then they went to Charlestown, Medford, Stoneham, and South Boston. So then they moved out. They converted houses into tenements. I was really surprised by learning this, that I didn't know the North End at that point had become the highest density city pretty much in the world, the equivalent of Calcutta. One of the key issues that happened with early on was this thing called the Eliot School Rebellion in 1859, when there was a lot of religious tension, and Irish Catholics were forced to say a Protestant version of the Ten Commandments, which prompted them to start their own school. So I'm showing now, again, a vintage photo of the church, St. Mary's. In 1836, it was the first Irish church in the North End and the second church in Boston. The Italian Catholics moved in and the Irish moved out. So we have a shifting of the population. The church attendance shrinks. What they do here in this church is they focus on internal renovations and they really ignore the external, and they ignore what's happening in the external environment, which in some ways is why the building gets demolished. So in 1976, they were denied a preservation status by the state because they had failed to integrate with the Italian neighborhood. They were no longer relevant. And so I'm just showing a picture of the building being demolished at this point in 1977. St. Stephen's was used by Italians, but it really was Protestant and then Irish. And so here what we see is different groups appropriating the building and engaging in multivocality. Again, this is a really interesting building. It's a Catholic church. which was central to Italian life. And because the Irish had already established churches in the North End, they actually couldn't be together in this same church. So you actually had separate churches for Italians and Irish. The St. Stephen's here, you can, if you can see it, it is a red brick building. It's very simple on the outside, and it has white highlighting and a cupola, which signals that this isn't really a traditional, this isn't a traditional Catholic church at all. It was designed by Bulfinch in 1804. The interior I'm showing you now looks a lot like Christ Church. It's Protestant, it's white, it's clean, it's got these pillars, there is no stained glass, and there's very little icons, which obviously was about the Protestant Reformation, was about getting rid of the icons. It was built for Protestants. It was first Congregationalists and then Unitarians. Then the Roman Catholic Church bought it in 1863 because they just had so many people coming in that they needed more churches. They expanded the church for Irish Catholics in 1870, and by 1960s, it had become an Italian Catholic parish. As you recall, by around 1920s, the Italians had started to dominate the North End, so they started taking over buildings. In 1964, Cardinal Cushing, who is the bishop of all the Catholic churches in Boston or Massachusetts, decided to restore this building. And why he decided to restore it, yeah, we'll talk about in a minute, but what that meant is he moved 1,600 Italian members out of the church to an alternative site for 15 months and spent a lot of money restoring it. Now, one thing to know is Cardinal Cushing was Irish. And his goal with this church was actually to reconcile the British and Irish past. So this was not about the Italians in the church at all. It was about all the Irish who live in Boston, which is a significant number, and really trying to reconcile what was happening in the United Kingdom and the fight between the Protestant Irish and the Catholic Irish, which really took off in the 1960s and was really intense. It's called the Troubles in the UK. So he takes this church symbolically as a way to show how you can reunite a troubled past between Irish Catholics and Protestant Catholics. So he says, standing on hallowed ground through 2.5 centuries, a Protestant and Catholic alike, St. Stephen's is the perfect example of ecumenism, which is a reconciliation. Of course, this isn't speaking to the Catholics at all. So that we thought was extremely interesting. In 1992, it closed as a parish and operated mission church. And it was given a preservation status, but because it was Bulfinch's church. What's really interesting is in the North End, given the dominance of Italians in the North End, there is no church in the North End that is used and was used predominantly by Italians that's gained preservation status. So that is an interesting issue into the future, because if Italians, and they are moving out because of the gentrification, will their history also be lost, which is sort of unimaginable in some ways because they've been so dominant in the area. The last thing we did was to visualize the patterns through comparison. So now here what we're trying to do, and what you do in a lot of studies, is you're trying to link the various elements that you've gotten together in the study to speak back to theory. So we're trying to link microfoundations to institutionalization with this graph. And what we've got in the graph is at the very top, we've got this big arrow that says wider institutional environment, and that's the understandings and resources that are funneling down into helping understand the meaning of the North End, which is another layer that we have right below that. And then below the meaning of the North End, we have a little box that says the micro foundations. And here we're focusing on the building.
You will have noticed that I gained a new Zoom background this week. Basically, it's the census.
What? I'm not sure whether I don't think that's me. I don't know where that came from. So anyway, what we're looking at is the building proprietors. Did they attach or detach to the building? And then what were the material practices of each of those groups? And If they attach or detach, that leads to different material practices. So when they attach, they try to protect the church or they try to maintain the church. When they detach, they appropriate the building. That is, they move into somebody else's building and then they reconstruct it or they alter it, or they do whatever they need to do to make it work for them. And they also, when they detach, they may repurpose the building for their own needs, such as St. Stephen's was done, which we just talked about. And this leads to different meanings and the way meaning is communicated. So when a material practice is protected and maintained, if it's protected, it can lead to multivocality, which is what we saw with Old North Church or Christ Church, where you had the incorporation of a conflicted history into the building itself and its narrative and meaning. If it's maintaining the building, what we saw in our case studies was that it actually led to a restricted understanding, that it was really only about Irish Catholics and it couldn't incorporate other people's presence or uses in the neighborhood. When they appropriate a building, again, they have multivocality because there's multiple parties that have been in this building, but they tend to be layered. And so they're not integrated and recognized. So it's like sediment that layers after each geological experience. And when they're repurposing, they're also layering the building. And what that meant, when we have some arrows going out to, how does that allow the people in the buildings to actually connect with the wider environment? And when you have multivocality, you can have resonance because you're speaking to people beside your own four walls and your own experience. And when you have a restricted or layered meaning, you tend to limit the resonance you can because you're restricting who you can speak to at any point in time. When you have a limited resonance, it tends to lead to demolition. When you have a wider resonance, it tends to lead to preservation. So the demolition leads to deinstitutionalization of the meaning in the North End, whereas the preservation allows for institutionalization. And then we have a box above preservation and demolition that shows social recognition. And that's really like the landmark committees were playing that role. So you have to gain the recognition from an outsider or group that will allow your meaning to continue. So the challenge for us was to push, and then for most researchers, is to push beyond the surface level. And the way you do that is to return to your key theory and look for differences between what you found and what the theory suggests. So the literature on place had two competing interpretations. One was the meaning of place was labile, that is malleable over time. The second was the meaning is stable and it's persistent. So what we did in this study is we were able to speak to those two conflicting interpretations by identifying the conditions of malleability versus stability. When buildings have layered meaning, one group detaches and is replaced by another with a different meaning system, therefore it's malleable. They alter the building to reflect that meaning, and it was more likely to lead to demolition. When people highlight multivocality of groups and meaning, they tended to be more stable and persistent over time. So that means that a building can be both flexible and offers stability, but also be diverse and inclusive. So I think that was really sort of the key findings. And that's where I end. I'm sorry if I took too long, and I'm very happy to take questions, comments, etc.
You can turn off the slides, then I will take care that the participants join you in the spotlight as they ask the questions.
Okay. Let me go back to stop share. There we go. There we go. Okay.
Thank you so much, Candace. And yeah, who would like to go first? I think there's something in the chat, but I'm not sure.
Not yet, or at least not. Not at my end. Maybe I'm missing something. But while we're waiting for the questions to be typed or for the hands to be raised, I would say this is really revolutionary in looking how very public institutions get reclaimed and made appropriate or made hospitable to different groups. And we have many participants that work on accessibility, on this notion of how workplaces are denying or including and how are making claims on our bodies, right? Including in our own research, Annika. So while this is very novel, both theoretically and methodologically, I think many of you who have read and identified with this work have probably begun to think about what are the institutions that your participants inhabit and how are those institutions reclaimed? How is that meaning remolded, and by whom and when? And you can ask a lot of questions about methodologies, but I think it's really the real opportunities is to take these novel methodologies and make them fit your context and your interest and your participants, right? Because it's something we can, now that we can see this in the context of Candace's work, like how can you bring it to your context, to your organizations, to your institutions? Because we used to take these institutions for granted, right? Like how specific they are to their purpose and how exclusive rather than inclusive they are. But let's start working on those logical leaps. Where do you see these methods permeate your own context and your own institution?
So Candace, I have a question, but it's not really about the method unless your answer takes it there. It's about this notion of the multivocality. And I was impressed when your reading revealed that a particular leader wanted to, merge two histories and leave out a third. And so what can you tell us, so I guess it is methodological, about how you looked for voices, when you stopped looking for voices, what cued you to keep looking? Am I making sense?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that if we go back to the approach we took when we were doing the initial coding of the cases, remember we were specifically looking for who was being talked about, who was acknowledged, who was pointed to, who did they mention, and what places did they mention. And so that is what struck us by having that kind of framing when we were doing the study all along, was when we started reading some of the sermons, it was like, this is really interesting. I mean, they didn't explicitly say, okay, we're gonna incorporate these two groups and we're gonna reconcile our history of conflict. No, not at all. They just did it implicitly by starting to point, starting to acknowledge the other, starting to acknowledge the importance of the other in terms of their own history. So you could see there was an expansion of understanding that came with recognition.
I love that phrase, an expansion that came with recognition. And I'm overlaying that with how you said, what we all know, that the survivors write the history. So at some point we have to accept that we're limited by what are the bodies and entities we choose to see.
Yeah.
But even within that, you found that recognition of others, that pointing.
Yes, yeah. And that, for me, that was the big difference between why we label something multivocal versus layered, right? Okay. So multivocality meant that they were actually recognizing the other while they were dominant. So layered meant that there was no recognition of the other. It was literally, they had been there, the people who were there at their own time wrote their own history, and then once they left and new people moved in, then a different history was written. That's why we're calling it layered, because there wasn't this recognition process.
I didn't catch that. I think it was in the drawing, but I didn't catch that the first time around, so thank you. I'm grateful for the differences.
Well, I probably went through it pretty quickly because I started worrying about how much time I was taking, but yeah, I mean, and so I think that's a really important issue, is who is being recognized by whom.
for sure.
is a very key thing to whether or not you're going to have multivocality and inclusion.
And if I can, oh, thank you so much. And if I can add, I mean, this is very new, is appreciating how materials can afford new spaces of interaction. And because so much of accessibility is premised of this idea of inclusion, yet we don't really know what the tolerances are and how materials will be used. So we were, Annika and I were so excited about this work as a new possibility methodologically to get at the reappropriation, the customization of different materials, of different technologies to promote inclusion.
And one of the things I'd like to point out that even though something seems inevitable at this moment or dominant, it doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. So that's a really important insight as well, that there is actually more kind of fluidity and processes happening. And it actually takes active work to maintain a dominance or to maintain something. So, it's not inevitable. The future is not inevitable. It has to be continually reconstructed through actions that are happening. And that means it also can be altered.
Thanks very much for watching. You can like and subscribe to our channel below. We're currently working on a British Academy funded project looking at the lived experience of disabled people during the pandemic. And you can find out what we're up to at tendproject.com or on Twitter at tendproject. Thank you.